Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Cyber Roundup. My name's Dave Gravel. I'm the president and CEO of a company called Greyvoc, and we have a hands-on experience right here in this room as we're doing a lot of the production, but we also have a fairly substantial information security practice that gives us a great amount of interest in this particular topic matter. In a minute, I'm going to have the others introduce themselves, but just wanted to share with you a bit of an experience here at the convention, because as I sat from session to session, it's interesting. Having a lot of years in the business, you get a chance to reflect back a little bit. When you used to talk to people about information security and cybersecurity, they'd say, well, I'm not a bank, it doesn't matter for me. That's just for banks, that's just for credit unions, that's just for the big guys. And I think based on the conversations that I heard yesterday in an e-commerce seminar and several of the others, that the awareness level that information security affects all of us and cybersecurity is a key issue that impacts all of us was really brought home. So with that, I'd like to introduce several of the panelists here, or have them introduce themselves and talk a bit about their perspective on information and cybersecurity, and then we'll roll from there. So. Okay.
With a perspective as well?
Yes.
All right. My name is Steve Gottwals. I'm the technical director of security solutions at Adobe. At Adobe, we're not just the Photoshop people. So when it comes to security, when I'm working with clients, it's mostly about sensitive information that's in documents. So sensitive information, PII, PHI, intellectual property, homeland security information that go into documents, and then we provide what we call data-centric security solutions. That's where you're encrypting data for confidentiality purposes, digital signatures on data for integrity and authenticity purposes. So things of that nature. I'll pass it down now.
Sure. I'm Shaun Reardon. I'm from Aon Benfield. And Aon Benfield is for those who don't know, it's the reinsurance brokerage arm of Aon. So the clients I work with are usually insurance companies who have cyber risk. And I'm a director in the cyber practice group at Aon Benfield. My perspective on cyber is from the insurance company perspective and from a risk modeling perspective. So we look at, as part of our job as a reinsurance broker, we look at modeling an insurance company's portfolio of risks.
Thank you, and Shaun Klann with Intelligent Buildings, happy to be here today. So our perspective on the topic of cyber is probably a little bit unique and a little bit different. So we're focused on an area of awareness and mitigation that probably many aren't even aware of yet. And it's really focused on the evaluation and mitigation of cybersecurity risk around the Internet of Things, and specifically the Internet of Things for real estate, right? So what we focus on is this ever-growing field of the connected devices inside of our facilities, whether these are the devices that control our air conditioning and heating systems, whether these are the devices that control our card access and security systems, our lighting control systems, irrigation, parking control, digital signage, on goes the list. There's over 9 billion square feet of commercial real estate in the United States of America right now. And inside of that 9 billion square feet, there's currently 1 billion connected devices inside of that portfolio controlling our different systems. The future of that is within 5 years, that 1 billion is going to change to 3.6 billion devices inside of our buildings that are controlling our systems. And I'll get into it maybe a little bit later, but the path that where real estate technology and operational technology deviated from enterprise technology is pretty significant, and as a result, the risk and the gap from a cybersecurity standpoint is pretty significant. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but that's really our unique take on the industry, where we really look to reduce risk around the Internet of Things, specifically for commercial and corporate real estate.
Michael?
Thank you. I'm Michael Flanagan, the CEO of Big Data Insure. We are a program resource developer for cyber, and my history goes back pretty far on cyber. I'm an insurance guy. In 1996, I was invited to the University of Illinois by two entrepreneurs that were formatting the internet. Essentially what you know today as www.http/Netscape and Spyglass. And for the first time in my career, I was challenged with trying to understand kind of what we know today as the tangible assets and the known perils, and the development of the intangible assets and the unknown perils, and the impact they'd have on a common business. And fast forward to 2001, I opened the first cyber risk practice for Arthur J. Gallagher, and was one of probably 10 guys in the industry at that point. And it brings us here today. There's a lot going on. I try to take a very pragmatic approach to assessing risk and exposure and diagnosis of the right solutions. And I know today probably what's on a lot of people's minds are what's going on with data breach. So we look forward to shedding some light on that, and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So with that as a bit of a segue, Michael, what is the size of the problem in terms of the issue of risk for cyber attacks and security breaches? How would you sort of put a parameter around it for us?
Well, the grassroots of it, there have been 900 million names taken and put into the dark web. And so if you really start down at the Attorney General level, where they're getting consumer complaints, it trickles up to you and your business. And so what we know today is that there's been a little bit of a paradigm shift around extortion and different techniques that people use. But one of the core issues is your 2014 ISO form has a data breach exclusion baked into it, but what's next? ISO's coming out with its own form soon. What we know today is that the events are doubling every year. The incidents and the events. So last year we had 4,000 events that were reported. It's probably a fraction of what really is going on. So data breaches in front of us. Yahoo is a great example, and the severity is significant, but I think and I want to keep stressing this because I think there's a lot of information out there for public companies with a lot of shareholders. But I think today what we're finally getting to, I'm a private company with a few shareholders, what's my impact? How do I protect my balance sheet? How do I transfer this risk? How do I understand the gapping of it? So it is becoming more frequent and probably coming from an area where it was more severe.
And it seems like, that's all we hear about is the big guys. So we hear about the Department of Defense and the GSA, and we hear about the Democratic National Committee. All those are well publicized, but in your experience, Steve, what would you say is probably, how low does it go? I mean, does it get right to the individual level, and where are we?
Sure, it goes very low, and I think, as Michael said, it's not going reported when it gets low enough, I think, is part of the problem. Everybody deals in this sensitive information. I mean, like I said, PII, personal identifiable information, you've got that sitting in your HR department, right? You might have PHI, but you've got intellectual property as well that you might just be concerned about. But PII is probably one of the biggest drivers, especially at that lower tier level. They need to protect their information.
Right. And I think oftentimes people think of the typical cyber attack as something with social security numbers and others, but I think that's really missing the full scope of what can go on. And I was listening to a discussion that Shaun was having in terms of buildings. Shaun, maybe you can relay from the Internet of Things perspective. It has nothing to do with social security numbers, but it does have a lot to do with what can happen to a building.
Yeah, I think that the common first reaction that people have is, what's the risk of, my HVAC system or my lighting system being breached, right? And maybe the first reaction is oh, well, it's kind of a nuisance, right? Some 18-year-old's going to come in and flash the lights, and it'll be funny, and it'll be a bit of a nuisance, right? But that's true, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it really talks about from what the risk and the ramifications are of something like this. So there's really kind of 5 and now recently 6 kind of individual risk areas that we like to focus on. The first is really around brand damage. Right, so you can't dispute the realities of brand damage if you're, say, a financial institution or a retail institution, and you make the front page of the newspaper, or you make the 5 o'clock news, and you say, hey, it's something simple like someone hacked in and they're changing my lights, but do you as a consumer feel good about shopping there or putting your money in that financial institution, right? So you can never underestimate the actual impact of brand damage, and that's a reality. Another area that we focus on is around equipment damage. So for anyone who followed the Stuxnet, right, which is just an amazing story around how the U.S. government and the Iranian governments created a virus and propagated that virus through industrial control systems to an Iranian nuclear reactor and destroyed the reactor and the centrifuge. That's a real life case example where in today's world of the building Internet of Things connected, people can cause real damage to million-dollar chillers and boilers and control systems and things like that. So that's a reality, right? So there's actual, physical capital damage that can occur inside of these facilities. There's also, life safety events, right? So our fire alarm systems, our elevator systems, our card access systems are now connected to the internet. There's mass evacuations that take place when these systems are breached, right? So there's real life safety risks associated with that. There's also productivity loss. So if I'm a manufacturing facility and I have to do an evacuation, or I can't get access to my equipment or my refinery or whatever it might be, there is a real tangible dollar amount associated with productivity loss. And the 6th this is a really interesting one. It's a relatively new one for our industry. It's not new to the cybersecurity industry at large, but it's new to the real estate industry, is ransomware. Right, so you think really simply, you go to work, you go downtown Chicago on a nice, January day, it's 15 degrees out, and lo and behold, you show up to work at 6 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning, and the building's closed because your HVAC control system was taken ransomware and you can't turn the heat of the building on, right? And this isn't fiction, because there's been 2 documented instances of that type of a scenario happening in the last 4 weeks. So these are new threats and new risks that we're trying to identify, and it goes way beyond just some 18-year-old kid flashing your lights inside your building. It goes everywhere from brand damage to productivity loss to capital loss to on goes the list. So I think the areas where cybersecurity can impact real estate are growing significantly.
And Shaun Reardon, Aon, what kind of programs do they have to support those types of issues? Are there programs out there, and what types of things can we do to ensure that risk is mitigated to some degree?
Well, mitigating your risk is tough and a little bit outside of the kind of realm of insurance, but I mean, we do think that there's a problem with underinsurance for people's information assets, which I know we were talking about buildings, but it's something we think that firms are very, very happy to insure their property up to probably close to 50% of what they think their maximum loss could be, but they're insuring their cyber information assets, things like company records, financial records, modes and methods of operation, source code, other intellectual property, to probably closer to 10 to 12% of what they have. So they can mitigate the risk to their balance sheet just by simply purchasing an insurance product that has made a lot of strides in the last few years to be much more relevant to that kind of protection.
I know Michael made reference to the fact that the attacks are happening at a 50% growth rate. As a matter of fact, it's been referenced that if we were to make it an industry, it would be one of the fastest growing industries would be cyber attacks, in terms of not only revenue dollars, but in terms of size of industry and impact that they're making. So. And it's reaching way down below. There was a reference made to ransomware. Steve, maybe you could just, we've got a lot of small, mid-tier businesses out there, companies that are maybe not as familiar, maybe give a perspective on ransomware so that people get it.
So ransomware is just one attack that you can get hit with, where the bad guys basically get into your systems and encrypt all your data for you. They're going to keep it safe for you, but then they hold the key ransom. So you don't get to decrypt your data unless you pay a hefty ransom. I know we were talking about this earlier. It's a lot of times people are getting in because of education, and when I sit down with clients, it's like, listen, I'm not going to offer you a silver bullet. I'm going to offer you a technology that helps with these problems that you can use to mitigate these risks. But education's a big deal, and we got to help educate our employees about these kinds of attacks. Another common one is someone sends an email to you, your employee, looks like it's coming from the CEO, and it says, I need the W-2s. They send them the W-2s, and it wasn't the CEO at all. So it's easy to spoof an email address. So these are the kinds of things you do want to educate folks, and then from there we can start talking about protection systems.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you made reference to assessment. As an insurer, what do you look for a company to do in terms of assessing their risk?
That's a tough question. So let me answer it a different way. For 12 years, there were 67 carriers that wrote open market program cyber. And unfortunately, we broke the language. So today, the terms that we used in cyber cross a huge spectrum, from e-commerce liability, network security, privacy liability. Today, we enter a new era. We're going from 67 to 400 carriers, to 400 to 2,000 by 2020. And the reform has been simple. The peril is cyber attack. That's what the government has told us, with separation between cyber terrorism and cyber hacktivism. Security liability is a federal and state issue, but the key piece is privacy liability. And that's a complicated issue. And I don't know, you guys probably don't follow it as I do, but the first data breach certified last week. It's a big deal. Finally, somebody went in front of a judge, a litigator went in front of a judge and said, this is what the damage was. He certified it. We now nationwide, another insurer has a certified class action for a data breach. So the playing field is setting up. There's some reform to the terms. So back to the assessment. The difficult part, the push-pull with the assessment is that for every individual function that we're talking about, I have to attest or warrant as a part of an application that I know or don't know. And so I think we've landed in the right place. Today, our applications don't ask you to attest to broad enterprise encryption, but we ask you if you've ever had an encryption problem or if you've ever had a ransomware problem. So we finally landed to where, and when we say this in our shop, the right coverage for the right price and the right services is what sells to manufacturers, to all these different cross industries. It's not all the coverage, but it's the coverage that you need and want for your clients or you as a client here that are going to be the key component. But the assessment can essentially open up too many things for the insurance discussion.
How about you, Shaun? Is there, in the insurance industry, is there some type of assessment that you require? I mean, when somebody comes and says, hey, I'm really interested in protecting myself against this risk, no different than fire, water, flood, what do I do?
Well, not from the broker perspective, but from a lot of insurers are using technology companies to kind of do a pre-assessment, especially for larger commercial risk. Mm-hmm. Companies like BitSight, Science, and a few others can do a single assessment on a company to determine if there is an active cyber incident going on. Of course, that doesn't really help you very much when a company is clean, and then goes negative, and then you have a claim. Mm-hmm. So insurers are using those tools. Just for people who are worried about their cyber liability and curious about just what their exposure is, I don't want to make this an Aon commercial, but Aon has a tool. If you Google Aon Cyber Diagnostic, you can fill out a pretty simple report that just asks you questions about your industry, the size of your company, and some of the security parameters that you have in place. And you can get an estimate as to both the kind of level of risk that your company has, and then also the likelihood that your risk is insurable. So if you're curious, I'd recommend people do that.
And we don't mind a bit of a commercial. It certainly is helpful. I mean, people are here to learn about what they can do, and obviously, the greatest risk you have is what you don't know. If you have no idea what your exposure is, you have no way to understand how to protect against it. If you have no way to protect against it, then you're opening yourself up to more potential risks. So I am very interested on the Internet of Things in terms of how do you go about mitigating and assessing what the potential exposure is?
Yeah, David, and if I can maybe start with just a little bit of maybe background to how we got here so we understand what the risk is, and then I can speak to how we go about mitigating it, right? So, so the interesting thing is, this is going back a couple decades, back to the 90s, right? So in the early to mid 90s, these industrial control system manufacturers, they jumped on the bandwagon with everyone else and said, great, let's make our devices connected, let's get them IP addresses, embedded web servers, all these different things that everybody was doing back in the 90s. And that's where probably the similarities start and end, right? So from there, the trajectory of where the Internet of Things and industrial control systems went is very different than where our enterprise IT systems went. So we all know today that in most organizations, the IT department, I mean, they have final say, right? They tell you what you can't do, what you can't download, what you can't access, and they do that for a reason, right? There's very rigorous policies and procedures in place, and there's direct owner access, right? So each corporation has their own internal IT department with their own internal funding and support mechanisms and policies and procedures and so forth like that. I say all that, everybody knows that, but that's the complete polar opposite in the real estate space, right? So the real estate space is segmented and jointed, and there's multiple layers where the building owner generally hires a property manager who hires a contractor to install an IoT device who then sources it from a manufacturer. So the building owner himself rarely has any input or control over the technology that goes into their facility, and they have no governance over it. So I say all that saying that there exist almost zero policies and regulations in the real estate space to how to govern this problem of IoT, right? So as all these devices are going in, and this is a reality, right? So I mean, the systems that control our lights and our HVAC, many of them are still running on Windows XP and Windows NT, right? And because the onus and the requirements weren't there for these manufacturers to upgrade along with Microsoft as they release their things, and we all know the holes and vulnerabilities of those outdated operating systems. But to replace a multi-million-dollar control system simply because it's running on Windows XP and Microsoft no longer supports it, that's not something that's in anyone's operating budget from a real estate standpoint. So this is how we got into kind of where the situation we are, where there is just this peril and there is this tremendous amount of risk that exists. So the way our organization approaches it is we've put together kind of a comprehensive solution all the way through to mitigate risk. That's the goal here, right? So we start by putting in what's missing, which is the policies and procedures, right? And that's, again, any big corporate enterprise entity will have that, but in the real estate space, it's just non-existent. So we start with developing policies and procedures and educating the various stakeholders that get involved in the real estate transactions. So property managers, architects, engineers, subcontractors, and stakeholders, and so forth like that. We'll also work to put an incident response plan in place because that generally doesn't exist in the real estate space either, right? So when there is a breach, what do? Right now, nothing happens mostly, right? So put an incident response plan in place so that you have a documented course of action of what to do when. So that's kind of the upfront planning and foundational stage. And then next is actual surveys and audits, right? So we offer, white hat penetration testing to figure out what are your risks and vulnerabilities on these industrial control systems. We offer on-site, boots on the ground site evaluations to figure out, what's your remote connectivity? Do you have vendors that have DSL lines coming into your facilities that you didn't even know about? Do you have Windows XP and NT running on your devices that control these systems? What's your architecture and things like that? So we'll do that on-site visual inspection, and then we'll go in through remediation to help them remediate and implement the correct network architectures and things of that nature. So it's a really end-to-end solution to start at the very basics and the basics that exist in enterprise IT, but then translate the lessons learned and the decades and decades of lessons learned in that space over to a space that's fairly ignorant and is still up and coming on that topic.
Interesting. Steve, in your environment, in the traditional software environment, there's probably nobody here that hasn't at one point in time used some form of Adobe. I heard yesterday in an e-commerce session, people talking about transferring information and, getting more engaged in e-commerce and using more technology and operating their business. What I was curious is from the manufacturer's perspective, from the software perspective, how do you overcome their concerns that this stuff is now flowing out there, maybe to the cloud, maybe somewhere else, and how can they be assured that things are being protected?
Yeah, so this is where we get into what we call data level security solutions. So we've evolved. I mean, the attacks have evolved and our mitigations have evolved. We started out, at the firewall and saying, we're going to just try to keep them out of the network, right? That worked for a while, but sooner or later, they're in the network, and you got to almost assume the breach, and they're getting in through IoT devices that are connected to our network, or they're getting through, people problems that are not educated. So then we fell back and we said, let's protect the device, right? Let's put personal firewalls on our computers. Let's put host intrusion detections on our computers. Well, at this point, we're now falling all the way back to the data. So we work with a solution with our customers where you can encrypt the actual document. This could be a PDF document or an Office document. The document is encrypted. Therefore, it's scrambled eggs, right? It's basically worthless. And it stays that way no matter where it goes. So you put it on a CD-ROM, put it on a USB stick, you can stick it in email. It's scrambled eggs no matter where it goes. But we tether that back to a server. So when somebody goes to access it, we're going to authenticate them, and we're going to check to see if they're allowed to have access to that document. So we get a couple good things out of this. One, we're protecting the information no matter where it goes. So if it goes to the cloud, fine. If it goes to an end device, if it goes to a mobile device, fine. It's protected. But it's also dynamic because we got the string connecting it back to a server. So we can revoke access to it at any time. We can change permissions on it. And we're also gaining audit events. Joe opened the document, at 12:30 from this IP address. Susie printed the document, from this IP address. What's interesting about that is we've got analytic systems we now train on that data. Because we haven't been very good up to this point in history at detecting breaches. But this will help us detect breaches on our sensitive data. So did Joe just open a document from 2 different IP addresses that resolve to 2 different parts of the planet? That could be a problem. That could be a stolen credential scenario. Is Sam printing way more documents than he normally prints? That might be an issue that we might want to tag for the security team. So these kinds of things where we're really falling now back all the way to the data. It's just another layer of defense. And I'm not saying you have to do this for all your data. Pick your most sensitive data.
I want to step back to the insurance side for a minute, Mike, because what should the business owner that's sitting out in this audience be doing in terms of purchasing insurance to protect themselves from a breach? Is there something that they currently should have in their portfolio of insurances? I mean, nobody questions building liability, umbrella, general liability, health, medical, all of that. Nobody ever questions that. Should they also be thinking about insurance for their cyber assets, for their information assets, for their data?
Yeah. So that's, again, I think we as a community have kind of confused, and so we're coming out of a period where I think there's becoming some clarity on what it is the small, medium-sized business owner would want. And I remember we went into pitch Google, and at the door, he stopped us and said, I don't need you to be better than any global insurance broker I need you to be better than a global litigator. Because the incidents, the past incidents, and maybe even the future claims don't tell me as much about really the three buckets, right? So you have the legal liability, the remediation, and then the damages. We just came out of a period where people looked at that first party product and thought that was insurance. It's not insurance. It doesn't really help you. It doesn't really pick up the tail of what essentially you're going to need in terms of the complexity of cyber litigation. So we're in a period right now where people are really starting to get it. They've done a lot of research. They get that insurance is a really key part of this, that a first-party policy, it's a gap to where you're going. But let me tell you the key thing. In 2003, Senator Dianne Feinstein introduced a bill called Security Breach Notification Act 1386. That's the core. And that's what we're seeing play out every day after day after day in the Valley, in New York City. The lack of ability to institutionalize the ability to disclose a business issue that has brand implications. So really, that's what we're trying to get at. And with safeguards, protection, and incident response, what we're trying to really vet out with all these different mechanisms are when something bad happens and you identify that there's been a cyber peril that's impacted the company, how long is it going to take you to disclose? It took Yahoo 18 months to come to market. They're going to get killed on that. Everybody keeps saying it, and nobody keeps listening. Disclose, have written policies and procedures. Make sure you get them. Make sure you customize to what you do. And so that's really at the core of this is the risk transfer, the protection's one thing, but the ability to understand. And I'll tell you that one of the inherent problems is the CSO reports to the CIO. So there's somewhat of a broken organizational mechanism there where a lot of the information security issues are not promoted as important as the IT issues, which drive the P&L and different things. So, what we know today is that institutionalized written policies and procedures in several different areas that support the notion that, yes, if we do identify that we've had a breach, we will disclose. We have an incident response plan. We have a lot of different things. The concern that everybody has today, and the marketplace for cyber is today $2.7 billion. The speculation it's going to somewhere around $10 billion. But the concern today is the aggregation of cloud computing. And that's going to be a thing that we'll have to deal with because it's somewhat inverse, the problem. The problem isn't that people are saving money going on the cloud. The problem is if the cloud source is the source of the hack, you don't have coverage. And that's a real difficult issue. London's struggling with the carriers here are struggling with it. And so what we're trying to do is just learn more about it. We're trying to influence the contractual liability, the business associate agreements, the critical infrastructure agreements that you're having to negotiate. But it's a layered issue and it's not easy to solve.
I'm glad you mentioned the cloud because it was kind of an interesting comment was made yesterday at one of the sessions where they said, one of the presenters said, gee, I got rid of my premise stuff and I put it all up in the cloud. I really don't have anything to worry about because I'm in the same cloud site that the Department of Defense is in. And as he said it, I was chuckling to myself saying, and so you're in where the breach occurred. and I couldn't agree with you more. The more we aggregate to a central site, the easier we make it to distribute the effect of a breach across many areas. That's not to say we should be afraid of the crowd. It just is another area that we have to be concerned with. And a lot of this boils down to, I think, some education and sessions like this that provide education to people on what can occur and how to avoid it. I mean, we tell our customers, written information security policies by themselves don't do it. but they at least get you thinking about it and get you understanding about it, and then conducting, vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, penetration tests, at least expose you to the areas of where you potentially could get breached. And then from there, it's looking at how do you mitigate against those. And I'm sure if I turn it over to Steve right now, he'll tell you the weakest link in the chain is
the employee.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about a topic that's not always discussed, social engineering, and get some perspective from people here on the social engineering aspects of the weak link in the chain for security. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, we hear it all the time, at least in the government space. We sort of tag it all with insider threat. Insider threat sounds malicious and like, very Edward Snowden-ish. But it also covers mistakes. And people get duped, and people just make mistakes. Sometimes they email stuff out to the wrong person, and they try to hit that, I didn't mean to send this, I recall this message. It's like, forget it, it's out, it's gone, right? So, education is a big one. And then we have to educate, and then we have tools that you can use, but we have to educate you first, I think.
Right. And Shaun Reardon, if you could, what types of, I noticed that you had indicated that there are educational tools that you recommend. What type of educational tools do you recommend to address the social engineering aspect of what could occur in the network?
When we look at breaches that we've seen across all the data we get from insurance companies, we see a lot of the breaches started just with a very, very small part of the company or with, say, a subcontractor. So I'd recommend companies, when using subcontractors, actually vet the subcontractor for make sure cybersecurity and vet their cybersecurity training. That can go a long way towards minimizing a social engineering breach at that sub that then affects your company. So I'd recommend just training is something it sounds very simple, but it's something that a lot of companies are not doing, and it's led to a lot of breaches.
How about you, Shaun? How do you educate the folks?
Yeah, so this is interesting and maybe a little comical in our area because, literally we are so far behind where the rest of enterprise IT is, right? So, just basic fundamental education goes a long, long way on this topic. I've worked with a lot of, Fortune 100, Fortune 1000 companies, and to Shaun's point, the rigors around how they manage their vendors and their business partners from a cybersecurity and a data protection and a PII standpoint are very, very rigorous. But when it comes to the real estate and facility management world, that doesn't exist. And when your service contractor that's servicing your lighting control or your HVAC, whatever, when they let an employee go, there are zero requirements for them to deactivate their user credentials, right? So that employee could go to a competitor, that employee could be disgruntled, whatever it is, and that employee is so far down almost the food chain and the contracting chain from the building owner that it's not even on anyone's radar. So I think education goes a very, very long way in our space, and people generally don't even know it's a risk. I've had numerous conversations with CIOs of very large, Fortune 100 organizations, and when we educate them that they have thousands of servers across their portfolio that aren't under their purview, that are running Windows XP and NT and things like that, their jaw literally hits the floor. And it's literally something that they had zero awareness around. So I think starting that conversation is a good place to start inside of our industry again, because we're really at the infancy of it.
And I can attest to what Shaun's talking about in terms of, when we go out and do a scan of a network, I would say more times than not, we'll find that the easiest open port to access is the HVAC system or the phone system. And they're giving you a free entryway. And remember, hacking is not about looking for something specific. Hacking is about looking for a way in. You'll find what you want eventually, or you can do what you want eventually, but hacking is all about finding a way in, finding through a point of entry. Michael, on your perspective, what do you think?
So great point, and great panel. And the thing is that when you have the discussion with the IT provider, and I've gone in front of judges with some companies, and it's always about the unauthorized user getting unauthorized access, right? And that's what you buy the technology for. It's the authorized user doing unauthorized things that you use insurance for. And don't think it's easy, because it plays back into the AI, the BI, the PD. It's all interrelated. It's not an easy answer. It touches a lot of elements of your existing programs that you've had for a long time, the crime, the fiduciary, the property damage, the personal injury. Although we have an easy answer, which is covering the insider doing damage, which is a large percentage of the problems, the hacking problems we have, the way it litigates is complicated, and where it touches inside the risk management program and how you loss control it, it's not easy. So,
Well, we hope you've gotten a good amount of information and some takeaways as BK talks about from this session as it pertains to cybersecurity. I know a lot of information is given. You could spend hours on this particular topic, but clearly we're out of time here, and we really appreciate the opportunity to give you some of that information, and we'll be hanging around a little bit, so if you got questions, please feel free to ask us. BK?